So this evening, we're going to be starting a new series of talks. So for the last few weeks, we've been having a series of conversations. This series is going to be just more of a kind of general talk format, and the overall theme is steps towards enlightenment. So there'll be various talks that will be given over the next 3 or 4 weeks. And this is the first one, and this is called The Path of Irregular Steps. So this talk is taken from a talk that was given by Sangharakshita. So Sangharakshita is the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order, Buddhist community, of which this centre is part. And this was a talk given about 50 years ago in the early mid-1970s, when many of you may not even have been born. It's a very, very, very rich talk. So I would recommend, it's freely available on free Buddhist audio. So I would recommend anybody who's particularly interested to listen to the talk. There's also a transcript available. So if you prefer just to read it, then it's possible to read it.
What is the talk called?
It's called The Path of Regular and Irregular Steps. Yes, Path of Regular and Irregular Steps. So the talk encompasses quite a lot of information, which we've sectioned off to cover over a number of weeks. So that gives you some idea of the richness of the material here. And we're going to be starting this week by the path of irregular steps. Next week, we're going to be having the path of regular steps, which will be, I'm going to change on. So it's just manifest as if by magic through the curtain.
Busy out there. Sorry, everyone.
So we're going to be doing it in a slightly different sequence from the way Sangharakshita did it. He kind of gave it all in one very, very rich talk. So we're going to be doing it in smaller chunks. So we're starting tonight with the path of irregular steps, which might not be the most obvious place to start, but that's where we are. So one way to begin the talk will have various kind of rhetorical questions in it. I'm not expecting anybody to answer these questions, but it's worthwhile just kind of bearing them in mind. And one of the first things to check is that I do assume that everybody here has some interest in Buddhism. Otherwise, why would you be in a Buddhist centre? So I think I'm fairly safe in that assumption that everybody here has some interest in Buddhism, Buddhist practice, some interest in some level leading a spiritual life. That's why you're here. And in a way, the path of irregular steps addresses kind of what we do with that interest, how we go about exploring further that interest and the pitfalls of where it can go wrong. Now, this is not about blame. This, to some extent, is quite natural, and it is infused with positive, very, very positive, very useful qualities that we should never let go of. But it is, as it were, irregular. It's not straightforward. And I shall sort of unpack as best I can different ways why this is not straightforward and why this is not automatically, as it were, a path of obvious regular steps. So one of the things that Sangharakshita he talks about lots of things, but there's a quote which I really liked. There are actually several quotes in the talk, but I'm only going to read this one out. It's very pithy, very short and very illuminating. It's from Goethe, a German philosopher who I think was Christian. He had nothing whatsoever to do with Buddhism, but it's very pertinent to what we're going to be talking about this evening. So I'll read the quote. So the quote is that the finest achievement for men or women, obviously, it's not singled out a particular gender. So for men as a sort of man, as a species, the finest achievement for men or women of thought is to fathom the fathomable and to quietly revere the unfathomable. So I'll read it again. The finest achievement for men or women of thought is to fathom the fathomable and to quietly revere the unfathomable. Now we might think, oh, that's all very clever, quite pithy. Yes, what a clever man Goethe was. But actually, when I thought about it and reflected on that, one of the reasons I liked it more than some of the other quotes was I find that really quite challenging. It's a challenge to our attitudes in the West that something would be considered unfathomable. We do not like to think that something is unfathomable. If English isn't your first language, to say unfathomable basically means to not be understood or to be beyond understanding. This language is quite archaic, so you could see it as being the finest achievement of men or women is to understand what is understandable and to quietly revere that which is beyond understanding. Now, the mere concept to the population of Cambridge, one of the most kind of intellectually advanced corners of the land, the mere concept that anything should be unfathomable or beyond understanding is quite a challenge. I found that quite a challenge when I thought about it, when I reflected on that quote. But actually, as I hope you'll be able to explore, it really gets to the nub of the problem. So the first kind of rhetorical question in a way is, do we really believe that anything for us is unfathomable? Do we really believe that anything is beyond our understanding? Do we really believe that? Or do we think, well, it just hasn't been explained to me in a clear enough way? If it was explained in a clear enough way, of course I would understand it. I'm a highly intelligent being. I have an IQ of whatever a high IQ might be. I may be highly qualified in my field of technology or mathematics or biology or even artificial intelligence, or of course it is not beyond my capabilities to understand. It just has to be explained. And if we take that quote, which wasn't directed at Buddhists or having anything to do with Buddhism, it was directed, I believe, at sort of Christians. So it was directed in a spiritual direction, but not specifically Buddhism. But if we apply it to Buddhism and we apply it to where we are right here and right now, if we look around this centre, we'll see lots of different things. So we'll see lots of posters for different courses that are coming up in the near future, where myself and other members of the Tuesday night team, and of course there's a Thursday night team as well, where there are also courses run, we'll be trying our best to explain things to you to make them fathomable. There are books all over the place. There's a bookshop there, there's a little bookshop there, there's our lending library around the corner, and then further around the corner, there's our reading room. chocked full of books on Buddhism, on Triratna Buddhism written by Sangharakshita and other Triratna writers, on Tibetan Buddhism, on Zen Buddhism, Theravadan Buddhism, Mahayana Sutras, the whole of the Pali Canon is just round the corner. We have access to a vast, vast array of resources to make Buddhism fathomable. So how should we, or can we, or what does it mean to us to revere that which is unfathomable? Surely it's fathomable in one of those books. Surely it's fathomable in one of those courses that we go on. Surely somebody will get up next week, Amarachandra, for example, and tell us the answer. That's why I find that quote really challenging, because it's inviting me to admit that there is something beyond all of those things. So what we can find, and what Sangharakshita very, very eloquently outlined, was that when we come across something that interests us, so we're in the Buddhist Centre, we've come along to the Buddhist Centre. I'm not sure if anybody's here for the first time this evening, but we have people in the course upstairs or next door who are certainly relatively new. Some of us have been coming for a long, long, long time, but at some point we all came through those doors for the first time. Inevitably, we had to come through those doors for the first time. And when we came through those doors for the first time, we found something that was of interest to us. We found something that kind of piqued our curiosity. And one of the responses to that curiosity, to that interest, can be that we want to reach the fathomable. We want to fathom it. We want to understand it. We almost have a greed to understand, a desperation, a craving to understand. We're fascinated by this thing we've come across, and we need to know it. So we embark on a program of reading all the books. So we go on lots of courses where we learn lots of things and we get introduced to some of the practices. And we find ourselves constantly going from one Buddhist book to the next Buddhist book to the next Buddhist book, starting at the top left-hand corner, working our way down to the bottom right of the library shelves in the Buddhism section. We're reading everything. We're assimilating all those lists, so we know every list that the Buddha delineated through the Pali Canon. We know the chronology of every Mahayana Sutra. We know the dates as near as we can to when these sutras were written down or when these sutras were presented. We know the symbolism of the shrine. We know the history of the symbolism of the Buddha. The Buddha didn't always look like this. In early days, there were other symbols to represent the Buddha. We have stupas that you may find at retreat centres. If you've been on retreat, we often walk round them. Stupas are rich in symbolism. You may be absolutely familiar with the history of the symbolism of the stupa. You may be familiar with the number of lists that generosity cropped up in. Generosity does crop up in a lot of Buddhist lists, and you might know every one of them. And you over time, you accumulate, you assimilate all of this knowledge. You fathom Buddhism, as it were. You read everything. You can get into discussions with people We have discussions over dinner parties and say, oh no, I think the Buddha said in such and such a sutta that such and such was the case. I think you'll find. And you'll be quite miffed if somebody proves you wrong. You'll have a sense of attachment to your knowledge of Buddhism. Does that sound familiar to people? Do people kind of have a familiarity with that response to something that interests you, to just grab and reach and get as much of it into you as possible? Now, that in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It's a perfectly understandable thing. We're very, very conditioned in the West to approach subjects in this way. We appropriate, we grab, we learn, we get to the bottom, we fathom everything that interests us. But the question really then arises, well, there's two things I could say at this point. One, as delineated by Sangharakshita, is that when we get to the point that we've, as it were, read the last Buddhist book written, we've read them all, we get to the point where instead of sort of, in a sense, looking up whilst we are climbing the mountain of knowledge, which is the Buddhist canon, we're sort of on top of it. And in a way, we're almost starting to look down upon it. There's a kind of an inversion can take place after a while, where we're not awestruck by the vastness and complexity and interest and subtlety of the Buddhist teaching. We feel we've fathomed it, we've mastered it, we've acquired it. And there's a sort of almost an arrogance starts to creep in that I know all that now. Nobody can argue with me about the content of any sutta or the history of the stupa symbolism or the history of the symbolism of the Buddha himself or any aspect of the Dharma. You've mastered it. And what can happen after that is you get bored. You get bored with Buddhism because you've mastered it. And your interest starts to wander around, and maybe instead of Triratna, you spot another group with maybe some great guru who's flown in from Tibet or China or Japan. And they wear robes. And you think, well, if they wear robes, they must have something more interesting to see. And so your interest starts drifting off in other directions. Or maybe it's another religion entirely. Maybe you think, well, Sufi poetry is really moving. Maybe Islam is interesting. And you move off towards Islam to acquire and fathom Islam or Hinduism or Judaism or any of the other panoply of world religions, or maybe poetry, whatever it might be. We have a tendency that when we have a sense of we have already fathomed, that our interest wanders. We wander off to something else. But over time, we find that that goes through exactly the same cycle. So there's a great acquisition, there's a fathoming and acquisitioning of all the information. Once we feel satisfied that we've understood deeply enough, we get bored and we wander off. And we can go through these cycles again and again and again. And although we've acquired lots of knowledge, lots of concepts, lots of ideas, we've made no spiritual progress. no significant spiritual progress has been made. We've kind of gone round and round in circles. So it does beggar the question, I'm sure many of you are asking, well, that's all very well, Kulapriya, but what is the unfathomable then? What is unfathomable? Well, I thought about that. And for me, you all have your own experiences, I'm sure. But for me, what is unfathomable, in a sense that it can't really be written down and can't really be read and understood in the same way that I understand it, would be something like an experience in meditation. So sometimes when you start to meditate, nothing much happens. You just feel assailed by random thoughts. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. But every now and then, when the conditions are right, you might be on retreat, suddenly you find yourself slipping into what is quite a different realm of consciousness from your normal one. So you find that you may be vaguely aware of thoughts going through your mind, but they are not bothering you in the slightest. You're kind of in complete control of them rather than them of you. You may find that you feel very, very joyful, very, very spacious. You may find that the normal idea of the boundary between Kulapriya here, finishing here, and then over there's over there, all gets a little bit blurred, that you're not quite sure where you begin and end and where over there begins and ends. That sort of experience, when we start to experience a different level of consciousness, often during meditation, not exclusively, but often during meditation, that to me would be an example of something which is quite unfathomable. I can say all those words and I know what that feeling feels like, but I can't convey that experience. I cannot get that into your experience. That's something you have to do for yourself. And also, I was thinking about as a second example, for those of you who are familiar with the Sevenfold Puja. Sevenfold Puja is a devotional aspect of Buddhist practice that we do here occasionally. So a Sevenfold Puja is a whole study in itself, but basically you recite various verses and then you chant some mantras at the end of those verses. And at the end of the last mantra, you all go silent. And the entire point of the puja is that silence. The entire point of the whole affair is just those few moments of silence at the end. That's the point. And you can do this puja tens, hundreds of times, and you just go through the motions, reciting the verses, waiting for a bit of silence, the bell rings, and then you go off and make a cup of tea. But every now and then, those moments of silence descend on the room, descend on the community doing the puja, and your heart bursts with love. Your cheeks are pouring with tears of love. You feel utterly connected, connected to life, connected to all beings in life. Fleetingly, momentarily, you feel that in those moments at the end of a puja. That is unfathomable. That cannot be learned from any book. That has to be experienced, and that is a mystery. You can do pujas on fantastic retreats, and that doesn't necessarily happen. You might go into a puja feeling really grumpy, thinking I was having a nice conversation. I don't want to come into this puja. But the bell rang, and so being good Buddhists, we do what we do after the bell rings. We're in a puja, and that happens. It's that magical, unknown quality of something completely other that cannot be conveyed in a book, cannot even be conveyed in this talk. It has to be experienced. You have to be there and you have to experience it for yourself. So the person next door to you might not be having that experience in exactly that same puja. That's the unfathomable nature of the mystery of it all. It's quite unique. So in a way, this Sangharakshita's presentation of the path of irregular steps was really a kind of an incredibly intellectual approach, that we come across something that interests us, we assimilate in this greedy quest to reach understanding. But in that, we've missed the whole mystery of the point of transformation. Now, as I was preparing this talk, I was aware that I could perfectly understand what Sangharakshita was saying, and I could understand what he was getting at. And I knew people, we've all come across people who, you know, they're always buried in a book, or they've got their plugs in listening to a talk, and they're always quoting things. But there's just this sense that there's not really, they're not kind of going anywhere. So we've all met these sorts of people. But as I was reflecting on Sangharakshita's talk, one of the things that struck me was that that's not how it worked for me. I didn't have that response. I didn't enter in to this kind of intellectual quest. That wasn't my path. My path was still irregular. I fully understood and could see what Sangharakshita was getting at. I couldn't say that was my experience. So this part of the talk that I've given, in a way, is me giving my interpretation of somebody else's experience of giving a talk or whatever 50 years ago. My experience was slightly different. So when I came along to Buddhism, so it came along roughly in my 40s. So I'd had 20 years of work as a scientist. And as a scientist, I spent a lot of time acquiring and accumulating and fathoming things in science. My whole bread and butter was about understanding and fathoming. That was how science works. I had to make sure that any experiment had a hypothesis that was based on reasonably sound science, that had a design of experiment that was beyond reproach, so that the experimental result could be presented and believed by anybody who wanted to listen or read the paper or whatever. So when I came along to Buddhism, in a way, I came along with a view that knowledge does not equal happiness. I had that view quite deeply imbued in me, looking back. I wasn't aware of that at the time, but looking back, I had this view that knowledge does not equal happiness. And it was happiness that I was after. When I say happiness, happiness is a thing that Buddhists say all the time. We don't mean something airy-fairy and slightly ungrounded. By happiness, I mean a kind of contentment with me in my life the way it is. There's a kind of robustness. There's a kind of an ability to be with life as it is, the ups and the downs, but not be kind of knocked from pillar to post by it. Also to be generally quite positive, but happiness is a little bit kind of a slightly airy-fairy sense to it. But we use the word happiness. When I say the word happiness, that's what I mean. I mean a robust contentment with life as it is and me in it. That was what I was looking for. So when I came along, and at this point, I'm very grateful to Kulapriya. Many of you know Kulapriya. He told me about this thing many years ago, and it's stuck in my mind ever since. And it's very pertinent here. He talks about the OK line. So for those of you who are scientists, you can visualize an X and Y graph. For those of you who are not scientists, it's just horizontal and vertical. So at the bottom of this graph, there's a terrible place. So the bottom of this graph is not good. Somewhere further up this graph, call it around about 80 or something in some arbitrary happiness scale, there's something that you might consider as being okay. So a lot of us, when we come along to Buddhist Centre, come along to Buddhist Centre, we're not okay. That's in a way why we come to a Buddhist Centre. We're looking for something. We don't know what, but we're looking because we don't feel okay with life. We're not down at the bottom. We're not in a terrible place, but we're maybe only about 60. So we're not okay, but we come along to Buddhist Centre. We might do some reading, but we hear talks. We meet people who seem to be on the same page as we are. We have interesting conversations. We make friends. We learn to meditate. And we do this regularly. We might even start to go on retreats. And we start over time to feel much better. So we go from 60 to 65, 70, 75. Then we're at 80. We're up at 80. We're okay now. We've been doing this for several weeks, several months. Now we're okay. If we keep going, we might even get to 85, 90. We're even better than okay. This is the best we've been since childhood, since primary school. This is fantastic. Then we start to think, oh, it's raining. I'm not sure I'll bother going tonight. I don't want to get wet. I can't find my umbrella. The phone rings. Somebody invites you to go see a film. Well, normally it's my Buddhist class tonight, but I've been there for weeks and weeks and weeks. So you go to see the film instead, or you go out for a meal, or you go to the pub, or you do all the different things that people do. And then 3 weeks or a month has passed and you haven't come along to the Buddhist Centre, and you start to feel slightly embarrassed about coming back. Like, what will they think of me? I've not been for ages. So you start to kind of think, oh, I'm not sure I'm feeling 100%. It's winter, it might be coming down with the cold. I'll miss it again. And over time, you start to lose your meditation practice. You're not keeping in touch with your friends. You're not keeping in touch with your friends, and you start to dip, and you start to fall down below the OK line, and you can feel this terrible place down at the bottom looming back at you. And you go back to the Buddhist Centre, and you can cycle backwards and forwards like this for months, for years, just going up and down around the OK line. In a way, that was my experience, more than kind of acquiring lots of information and then getting slightly bored. I wanted to find, as it were, happiness. And I found it, then I would lose it, then I would re-find it, then I would lose it, then I would re-find it, and then I would lose it. Both of these approaches, so people might resonate with one approach more than the other. Both of these approaches end up in the same hopeless cycle of just going round and making no significant spiritual progress. I'm going to have to speed up because we're running out of time. But I don't want this talk, I mean, the sound actually gives the talk, he intermixed kind of things that you might consider as being slightly negative with things that, you know, would be the more positive kind of aspects of the spiritual path. Because we've done this, I didn't want this to seem too negative. So there are a lot of positive things in both of those approaches. And we'll all have these things, and we should remember and hold on to them. So these things are that we learn. We are still learning as we go round these cycles. They might feel, looking back, that they were slightly futile, but actually we are learning. If we are reading lots of Dharma, we are by nature learning. As we are going up and down, above and below the OK line, we are slowly getting to know ourselves better, our tendencies, our habits, our views, our triggers. We are still building up a useful bank of information in the background. And by going through all of these different cycles and by not just disappearing entirely, we have a strong intention, an intention to change. And that strong intention can carry us quite a long way once we get our feet firmly on the right track. We have faith to keep going round these cycles. We have some degree of faith that we can change. Again, an incredibly useful and powerful motivator and attribute to have when we get ourselves on the right track. And we have willingness to put effort in. To read all those books takes a lot of effort. We are willing to put the effort in to achieve the ends that we need or want. So I shall finalize by saying that if you find yourself on the path of irregular steps, which is very, very, very common, then don't dwell on past failures. Don't dwell on past failures. Dwell only on future transformation. Dwell only on future transformation. So, next week, we'll hear a bit more about how to do that, when Amarachandra will be giving a talk on the path of regular steps as opposed to irregular. So that's officially tea time now. And then after tea, we'll have the opportunity to discuss anything that's come up for you in smaller groups. And I'll give you some questions. Just if nothing alive has come up that you want to discuss, then you've got these questions to have a look at. So we'll do that after tea.